Your supervisor gave you feedback, it was not even that bad, maybe it was completely neutral, maybe it was genuinely constructive, but something about it landed like a punch, and now you cannot stop thinking about it. You have replayed the moment 17 times. You have convinced yourself they think you are incompetent, you are lying awake at 2 a.m., wondering if you are cut out for this field. And the logical part of your brain knows you are overreacting, but that knowledge does absolutely nothing to make the feeling stop. If that sounds familiar, you are not dramatic, you are not too sensitive, you are not weak. You might have something called Rejection Sensitive Dysphoria, and it is one of the most common and least talked about features of ADHD. Today we are going to talk about what it actually is, why it hits so hard in clinical settings specifically, and what you can actually do to manage it without just being told to develop thicker skin. So, what is rejection sensitive dysphoria? The word dysphoria means a state of unease or dissatisfaction. Rejection sensitive dysphoria, or RSD, is an intense emotional response to perceived criticism, rejection, failure, or the sense that you have disappointed someone. And the key word there is perceived. You do not need to actually be rejected or criticized for RSD to activate. The perception alone is enough. For people with ADHD, RSD is not just feeling a little hurt when someone says something critical. It is a flooding emotional response that feels completely out of proportion to what actually happened and is extremely difficult to regulate once it starts. Researchers believe RSD is connected to the same dopamine and norepinephrine dysregulation that underlies ADHD itself, which means it is not a personality flaw or an emotional immaturity. It is a feature of how ADHD brains process emotional stimuli. The emotional response is real, it is intense, and it arrives fast, faster than your rational brain can catch up to it. Before we talk about clinical settings specifically, I want to talk about how RSD shows up in everyday life because I think understanding the full picture makes the clinical piece make a lot more sense. RSD does not only activate in response to actual criticism, it also activates in anticipation of it, which means a significant amount of the avoidance, people-pleasing, and perfectionism that shows up in ADHD is actually RSD running in the background trying to prevent rejection before it happens. Think about the last time you did not speak up in a meeting or a clinical discussion even though you had something valuable to say, or the last time you rewrote an email 15 times because you were afraid of how it would land, or the last time you stayed quiet when you disagreed with something because the idea of someone reacting negatively felt unbearable. That is RSD in anticipation mode. It is not shyness, it is not imposter syndrome, although those can overlap. It is your nervous system running a constant threat assessment and deciding that staying small is safer than risking rejection. And the cost of that is enormous. Every time you stay quiet when you have something to contribute, every time you shrink yourself to avoid a reaction, every time you say yes when you mean no because the alternative feels too threatening, you are paying a tax on your own potential. And over weeks and months and years, that tax compounds into a version of yourself that is smaller and quieter and less present than you actually are. Understanding that this is RSD and not just who you are is the first step to changing it. Because you can work with a neurological pattern, you cannot work with a personality trait you believe is fixed. Now, here is why clinical settings are a particularly difficult environment for people with RSD. Healthcare training is built on feedback. Constant, direct, evaluative feedback. Your clinical instructor is assessing your performance every single day. Your program is grading everything you do. Patients are responding to you in real time. You are being watched, evaluated, and corrected on a continuous loop. For a neurotypical brain, that is stressful but manageable. For an ADHD brain with RSD, it can feel like being in a state of low-grade threat response for the entire duration of a rotation. Every piece of feedback, even neutral or positive feedback, gets filtered through the RSD lens. Did they mean that critically? Was that tone off? Are they disappointed in me? Did I do something wrong that I am not aware of? The brain is constantly scanning for signs of rejection or disapproval even when none exist. And the exhaustion of that constant scanning is real. By the end of a clinical day, you are not just tired from the physical and cognitive demands of the work, you are tired from the emotional vigilance of managing RSD on top of everything else. One of the most disruptive features of RSD is rumination, the inability to let something go even after you have consciously decided to move on from it. You leave the clinical site, you get in your car, you tell yourself it is fine, it was just feedback, everyone gets feedback. And then for the next 4 hours, your brain replays the interaction on a loop, finding new angles to be distressed about, generating new interpretations that are progressively worse than the last one. This is not a choice. It is not something you can just decide to stop doing. Rumination in ADHD is driven by the same difficulty with cognitive switching that makes it hard to transition between tasks. Your brain gets stuck on the emotional content the same way it gets stuck on an interesting problem. It keeps processing and processing because it does not have a reliable off switch. And the consequence is that one piece of feedback that a classmate processed and moved on from in 20 minutes is still actively affecting your sleep, your confidence, and your clinical performance 2 days later. That is not weakness. That is RSD. I also want to talk about something that does not get discussed enough in the context of RSD, and that is the physical experience of it. RSD is not just an emotional event, it is a full body experience. When RSD activates, many people describe a physical sensation in their chest, a tightening, a heaviness, something that feels almost like grief or like the floor dropping out from under you. Some people feel it in their stomach, some people feel their face flush or their throat tighten. Some people feel a wave of heat or a sudden urge to cry that comes from nowhere and feels impossible to suppress in a professional setting. This physical dimension of RSD is important to understand because it explains why simply telling yourself that the feedback was not a big deal does not work. You are not dealing with a thought that needs to be corrected. You are dealing with a physiological response that needs to move through your body before your rational brain can get any traction. This is why the strategies for managing RSD are not cognitive reframes you do in the moment. They are nervous system regulation tools you use before, during, and after the response. You cannot think your way out of a physiological flood. You have to move through it first. Slow, deep breathing activates your parasympathetic nervous system and starts to bring the physiological response down. Physical movement, even just a short walk, helps discharge the stress hormones that flood your system during an RSD episode. Cold water on your face or wrists can interrupt the physical escalation. These are not metaphors, they are biology. Use them. And then once the physical intensity has reduced, which it will, that is when you sit down with the cognitive tools, not before. So what do you actually do about it? Because I want to be honest with you up front, there is no fix that makes RSD go away completely. But there are strategies that meaningfully reduce its impact on your clinical life and your well-being. The first strategy is creating a gap between the emotional response and your reaction to it. When feedback lands hard, the goal is not to immediately process it or respond to it. The goal is to survive the first wave of the emotional response without making it worse. You do not have to have a reaction in the moment. It is completely professional to say thank you, I am going to think about how to apply that, and then give yourself time before you sit with the actual content of what was said. The emotional intensity of RSD typically peaks within minutes and then starts to decrease. If you can get through that initial wave without ruminating, catastrophizing, or making any decisions from that emotional state, you are already ahead. The second strategy is separating the feedback from your identity. Feedback is information about a specific behavior or skill in a specific moment. It is not a verdict on your capability as a clinician. It is not a verdict on your worth as a person. It is data, and data can be used to improve. This reframe sounds simple, but it requires active practice because RSD automatically fuses feedback with identity. Every correction feels like it means something about who you are rather than what you did. Consciously pulling those two things apart every single time is how you gradually retrain that automatic response. Try this. When you receive feedback that triggers RSD, write it down as a clinical observation rather than a personal statement. Instead of my supervisor thinks I am incompetent, write my supervisor observed that my documentation timing needs improvement. The content is the same. The emotional weight is completely different. The third strategy is a structured debrief after hard interactions. Instead of letting your brain ruminate unstructured, which just means spinning in circles, give it a framework to work within. After a difficult feedback moment or a hard clinical interaction, write down the answers to 5 questions. What actually happened, as factually as possible with no interpretation? What was within my control? What was outside of my control? What does this feedback tell me about an area I am still developing? And what did I actually do well in this interaction that I might be minimizing right now? That last question is essential for ADHD brains with RSD because we have a strong negativity bias that makes us dismiss our wins and amplify our mistakes. Forcing yourself to name something you did well is not toxic positivity. It is correcting a genuine perceptual distortion. After you have answered all 5 questions, close the journal and make a conscious decision to let it go for tonight. You have processed it. You have extracted what is useful. Continuing to think about it beyond this point is not productive reflection. It is your nervous system stuck in a loop, and you have the awareness now to recognize that and redirect. The fourth strategy is learning to advocate for your learning style without disclosing your diagnosis. You do not ever have to tell a clinical instructor or supervisor that you have ADHD. That is entirely your choice and your right, but you can communicate what you need in ways that are completely professional and completely reasonable. If you process feedback better in writing, you can say, I want to make sure I am implementing your feedback accurately. Would it be okay if I followed up our verbal conversations with a quick written summary so I can reference it throughout the week? That is not disclosing anything. That is being an engaged and self-aware learner. If you are struggling with something specific, bring it up early. Clinical instructors respond significantly better to, I have been finding documentation timing challenging, and I want to figure out a better system in week 2 than to the same conversation in week 7 when it has already become a documented pattern. Early disclosure of a specific challenge reads as self-awareness. Late disclosure of a pattern reads as a problem. You are allowed to advocate for yourself. In fact, doing so is one of the most clinically relevant skills you will develop in your training, because advocating for patients starts with knowing how to advocate for yourself. I want to add one more thing before we close, because I think it is something a lot of people with RSD need to hear explicitly. The hypervigilance that RSD creates, the constant scanning for signs of disapproval, the anticipatory anxiety before feedback conversations, the emotional exhaustion of managing all of that on top of an already demanding training program, that is a significant burden. And it is one that most of your peers, your instructors, and even your program directors do not fully understand or account for. That does not mean you are at a disadvantage forever. It means you are carrying something extra right now that requires extra tools and extra self-compassion. And building those tools is exactly what you are doing. Every time you use the debrief framework instead of ruminating, you are building a new neural pathway. Every time you separate feedback from identity, you are weakening the automatic fusion between criticism and worth. Every time you regulate your nervous system after an RSD episode instead of letting it spiral, you are literally changing how your brain responds to perceived rejection over time. RSD does not define your ceiling. It is a challenge you are learning to manage. And the fact that you are here, still showing up, still trying to understand your brain and build better systems, that already tells me something important about who you are and what you are capable of. I want to close with something I think is really important. Having RSD does not make you less suited for healthcare. It does not make you too emotional for clinical work. Some of the most compassionate and attuned clinicians are people who feel things deeply, who care intensely about doing right by their patients, and who take their work seriously enough that feedback matters to them. The goal is not to stop feeling. The goal is to feel without being derailed by it, to process hard moments without letting them consume you, to take feedback seriously without letting it become a verdict on who you are. That is a skill, and like every skill in healthcare, it gets better with deliberate practice. You are not too sensitive for this field. You are exactly sensitive enough. You just need better tools for managing what that sensitivity costs you, and that is exactly what this channel is here to help you build. If any of this resonated with you, the Mind and Motion Clinical Focus Guide has a full section on emotional regulation in clinical settings, including the structured debrief framework I walked through today, and tools for managing the emotional demands of rotations specifically. The reading guide walks you through the full system, and the workbook has the actual debrief pages you can use after hard clinical days. Both are linked in the description along with the bundle. Structure your mind, move with purpose. I will see you in the next one.